Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American, where I examine the week's news from a progressive perspective. Join me as we go over the assassination of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, rising voter turnout in Georgia, Harris's interview with Bret Baier, and much more. With less than 3 weeks to go in the election, let's jump into the news. In foreign policy news, Yahya Sinwar, the terrorist leader of Hamas and the mastermind behind the attack on October 7th, is dead. Israeli forces confirmed that they killed the Hamas leader in a firefight on Wednesday, October 16th, just 9 days after the one-year anniversary of his attack on innocent men, women, and children. While officials initially were hesitant to confirm his death, as they were not yet aware that the militant they had killed was Sinwar, later biological tests on the Hamas fighter confirmed his death.
And I have an Israeli official in Tel Aviv messaging me now that the Foreign Minister Katz, has just confirmed that he is dead. I'm looking throughout the rest of my phone, but so far they're expecting a confirmation from the Prime Minister, but that may not come immediately. But we are told now, I am told, from an Israeli official that the Foreign Minister has said this. I've got it in Hebrew, and I'm looking at for the English translation in my phone. Peter, if this is in fact true, it's just an extraordinary development. This is the mastermind of October 7th.
While it is unclear if Israel will seek a more peaceful approach going forward, the Biden administration is seeking to encourage the Israeli government to use Sinwar's death to push for hostage negotiations. However, as Politico's Jonathan Lemire notes, Yahya Sinwar's brother Mohammed Sinwar is likely to take over, and he is considered to be more of a hardliner. Combine that with Netanyahu's complete unwillingness to engage in the peace process, and it is unlikely that this assassination will bring peace. Now, right off the bat, I have to point out that some people online are under the impression that Sinwar is some sort of martyr, that he wasn't a tyrant and abuser of Palestinians and Israelis alike. When Sinwar was rising within the ranks of Hamas, he was in charge of an organization that was responsible for hunting down suspected traitors and spies for Israel in Khan Yunis, and he was so brutal in his torture that he was known as the Butcher of Khan Yunis. Now, I know most of these people who are saying and promoting this stuff are fringe and mostly online, but it does need to be reiterated. When people see others celebrating a terrorist's life, it doesn't help us get anywhere close to a ceasefire or to a long-term peace for a Palestinian state. What it does create is an environment for people to distrust any and all calls for peace as a means to allow Hamas to rearm and to escape the consequences of their actions. And it is critical that we avoid that perception, not only because that is not the goal, as the goal is to end the war and to save lives, but also because it prevents a long-term recognition of Palestinian dignity and human rights. We have an opportunity to not only push for a change in the state of Palestinian resistance, but also to press for a ceasefire and end the war here and now. Hamas's leader is dead, and while the organization is still an issue, the death of the architect of October 7th is not only good, but it is also a new way to demand support for innocent civilians who had nothing to do with the terrorist attack. Sinwar's death is a signal that not only are the perpetrators of October 7th increasingly not in the picture, but so too is the clear goal that Israel claims they have in mind when waging this war. In other words, the basis for the war is increasingly slim. If a ceasefire is possible, then pointing out that this war has gone beyond October 7th is critical, and that the continued need for a ceasefire remains. Speaking of Israel, the Biden administration has issued a warning to the country that it must allow humanitarian aid to Gaza within 30 days or risk an arms embargo. The letter, which according to the New York Times was sent on Sunday, is yet another example of the Biden administration's tensions with Netanyahu and his continued war in the region. According to the Times, State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller noted that the amount of aid entering Gaza was at the lowest point it had been since October 7th last year. In a statement, Miller said that aid had, quote, fallen by over 50% from where it was at its peak, unquote. While Israel has worked to some extent with the Biden administration, such as its agreement not to strike nuclear facilities in Iran, Palestinians are still starving. The Associated Press reported earlier this week that an estimated 1.8 million Palestinians are suffering from, quote, crisis levels of hunger, unquote. While it is unclear how Israel will respond, it remains painfully clear that Israel is unlikely to end its ongoing invasion of Lebanon or its siege in Gaza. Moreover, we have seen Israeli civilians and settlers actively attempt to block aid to Gaza and prevent it from reaching starving Palestinians. Simply put, the 30-day grace period is far too long. Israel has consistently failed to distinguish between civilians and military combatants, and seemingly has no interest in helping prevent these people from starving, irrespective of their actual involvement with Hamas. If the Biden administration seriously wants to end this suffering, it must demand a ceasefire and block any further weapons to Israel unless Israel decides to allow aid and respect international law. In more domestic news, early voting has started across America as the election gets closer and closer. In Georgia, which Trump lost in 2020, voter turnout has exploded far beyond its expected levels. On Tuesday, more than 300,000 people voted early, and on Wednesday, there was another record of voting that occurred, with an estimated 269,000 plus people casting a ballot. According to State Affairs, 16.1% of the state's active voters had cast a ballot as of Friday. While it is a good sign that large swaths of Georgians are voting, and it is good to see Americans participating in the process, it is worth reminding everybody that this isn't necessarily a sign of Democratic strength. Unlike 2020, Democrats, while they have previously pushed hard for early voting and Trump has opposed it, Republicans have actively switched a little bit and are now encouraging their party to engage with the process in spite of the obvious rhetorical contradictions that come with it. Trump currently leads in Georgia's overall polling, according to the New York Times, by about 2%. And it does look like white older voters are the ones who are contributing the most to the earlier voting count. So it is likely that Trump is still leading to some extent, although that is not guaranteed considering there is still some risk of a polling error. However, it is still overall a good sign that people are more likely to vote than initially anticipated. They're more motivated, and it is a good sign if this applies further to states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, states that Harris really needs. However, we won't really know until Election Day or possibly even later. While the votes are still being counted and the election will inevitably be close, I want to take this time to tell you all to please vote. If you have not already, please consider checking iwillvote.com to find your local polling place and make a plan to vote, whether that's early, absentee, or in person. Trump is far too dangerous for Americans to stay home this time around. Every vote counts, and every American should make their voices heard, if not for their own sake, then for the sake of their country. In other news, Vice President Kamala Harris went on Fox News on Wednesday for an interview with Bret Baier. During that interview, Harris went over a variety of issues, including the economy, immigration, and strengthening democracy. The interview, which was widely perceived to be popular, had an estimated 7.1 million people listening to the show. The interview, which was at times combative, was not perfect, and Baier repeatedly failed to let Harris speak without interruption, but overall it was good for her campaign and for her to explain her policy positions. For example, while Harris was pressed on her immigration policy, she held firm and made clear that she would uphold the law while also working to keep a human touch.
There's a lot of people that look back at what you said in 2019 when you first ran for president. And there have been changes, and you've talked about some of them. When it comes to immigration, you supported allowing immigrants in the country illegally to apply for driver's license, to qualify for free tuition at universities, to be enrolled in free health care. Do you still support those things?
Listen, that was 5 years ago, and I'm very clear that I will follow the law. I have made that statement over and over again, and as Vice President of the United States, that's exactly what I've done, not to mention before.
If that's the case, you chose a running mate, Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, who signed those very things into state law. So do you support that?
We are very clear, and I am very clear, as is Tim Walz, that we must support and enforce federal law, and that is exactly what we will do.
So decriminalizing border crossings, like you said in 2019.
I do not believe in decriminalizing border crossings, and I've not done that as vice president. I will not do that as president.
In another instance, however, Bret Baier showed his true colors, seemingly trying to trick the vice president during a segment in which he asked her about comments she made, accusing the former president of threatening to use the military against political opponents, who he deems radicals. Harris then proceeded to call him out for using the wrong clip.
The question to the former president today, Harris Faulkner had a town hall, and this is how he responded.
I heard about that. They were saying I was like threatening. I'm not threatening anybody. They're the ones doing the threatening. They do phony investigations. I've been investigated more than Alphonse Capone. He was the greatest gangster. No, it's true. No, but think of it. It's called weaponization of government. It's a terrible thing.
So,
Brett, I'm sorry, and with all due respect, that clip was not what he has been saying about the enemy within that he has repeated when he's speaking about the American people. That's not what you just showed.
Well, he was asked about that specific...
No, that's not what you just showed. In all fairness and respect to you,
that was the question that we asked him.
You didn't show that, and here's the bottom line. He has repeated it many times, and you and I both know that. And you and I both know that he has talked about turning the American military on the American people. He has talked about going after people who are engaged in peaceful protest. He has talked about locking people up because they disagree with him. This is a democracy. And in a democracy, the President of the United States, in the United States of America, should be willing to be able to handle criticism without saying he'd lock people up for doing it. And this is what is at stake, which is why you have someone like the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying what Mark Milley has said about Donald Trump being a threat to the United States of America.
Now, I should note Baer later argued that he was looking for a much larger, more contextualized clip for Trump's comments, and that may very well be true. But the fact remains that downplaying a presidential candidate referring to the military being used against Americans is dishonest and unacceptable, regardless of how you do it. And this is another example of people at Fox News and in conservative media saying they made a mistake or pretending like they weren't actively trying to downplay the severity of a comment made by a potential president, a man who has held the levers of unmitigated power before and abused them relentlessly. This is unacceptable. Whether or not Brett Baer wanted a larger clip or more context, he was still trying to argue that Donald Trump didn't say something that he was on record as saying. Trump can play all these obfuscations, these lies, and people like Baer can cover for them as much as they like, but we all saw what he said. Donald Trump is dangerous, and Harris rightfully noted that that was the case. And while it is unclear where the election will go or even how this interview will impact the body politic, one thing is very clear. Harris was absolutely right to point out that Donald Trump is a threat to the well-being of the American people. It is high time that we call Donald Trump out every single time he says something like this and hammer it home until he finally falls because of his own actions. Donald Trump is a threat to America and the American people, period. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can check out all my other ones on Spotify or on YouTube in the weekly update playlist. You can also check out my articles at theprogressiveamerican.com. Thanks again for listening and have a wonderful day.